it's co-hosted by the co-operators. The theme is on innovative solutions for housing and sustainable urban development. We do have joining us here in person Robert Bartlett, Chief Administrative Officer of the District of West Vancouver, BC, Canada. And we also have Roger Busheman from Adenin Capital. He's the President and CEO. And then also joining us virtually, we have Raul Salazar, Chief of the UNDRR Regional Office for the Americas and Caribbean. So I'll kick it right off and give the floor to Roger.
If I use the mic, there we go. So bonjour à tous et très heureux d'être ici. So as an asset manager, Addenda Capital is an asset manager. So we manage clients' money, and to do that, we have a fiduciary obligation, and our fiduciary obligation in Canada is expressly to deliver financial returns for our clients. There is no other scope of obligation within our neck of the woods here. However, we have, for the past number of years, have understood that incorporating non-financial analysis into our work beyond financial analysis gives us better financial results. So that's incorporating ESG, it's what we call ESG integration. So it's basically using more information than less. And then secondly, over the past number of years, we've recognized that we can actually make impact investments, and that's been used certainly in the panel before us. So impact investments for us are investments where we have a market-like financial return and, not or, and a non-financial return which we are intent on receiving and which we can measure. So we actually report on that to our clients, not only the financial return, but also the non-financial return. And that can be toward environmental issues around climate change, or it can be around community, as was mentioned before. It can be around healthcare, education, those sort of things. So the point I'm making here is that we manage money for insurance companies and for pensions and for mutual funds. We touch roughly 1.5 million Canadian families. And those are people who have a premium for their car insurance, their home insurance, their farm insurance. They're participants in a pension plan. That's their retirement money. That is the capital we represent. And so that capital needs to get a financial return. But now we have this intent on getting non-financial returns, which we are aware of and which we can align. And we think that that is actually completely in line with our fiduciary obligation, because our clients are totally aligned with those. So that's fairly new. And as we bring to this conversation around resilience investing, we represent the private capital part. And sometimes it's said, oh, that's rich people getting richer off infrastructure projects. It's not. It really isn't. It's about everyday families who have their assets either managed, because that's the pension participant, or, as I said, they're an insurance client through some very basic premiums that they're paying for insurance coverage. That money needs to get a financial return. We can give it a non-financial return. So that's just to frame where we come from. I don't want to take too much more time, but that's the capital portion of this. And obviously, this is a very, very interesting project that we're talking about, bringing private capital to actually make investments in making communities more resilient and better adapted to the scale of climate change that's already occurring. And obviously, from a municipal perspective in Canada, that's ground zero, right? So that's something we're trying to solve. It's not easy. I don't want to get into it, but I think we're pretty excited about it.
Thank you for that, Roger. Yeah, impact investing, very important for our work. And perhaps we'll hold the questions and we can go to questions after. I don't know if you had a structure set up previously, or you okay with that? Yeah? Okay, perfect. So I don't believe Yvonne is here. You'll have to forgive me. I can't see the speakers list. I didn't see Yvonne previously. So can I please call Raul Salazar to speak, please.
Sure. Hello. Can you hear me well? Hello, can you hear me well? Okay, thank you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to share with you the perspective of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. The acronym is UNDRR. The reflection that we would like to share is in relation to how we are building this mobilization of private and financial sector, how we are working together with the partners of the private sector for building this climate resilient infrastructure and communities. Allow me to share briefly, I don't know if I can share a screen with you. Let me just, okay, I'm here. Okay. As you know, I don't know if you can see it properly. Can you confirm?
Yes, very good. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you. Well, basically the idea around this reflection is on the Sendai framework for disaster reduction and how this addresses investments. In 2015, when countries met in Sendai in Japan, adopted this framework, which is basically a framework that calls countries to build resilience, is to build resilient societies. Is basically the objective of it. They reduce the losses in lives, in economic assets, and other aspects of what make a society what it is. Basically, what they agreed is 4 priorities of action. You are seeing that one of these priorities was the 3rd priority, basically, is called investing in disaster reduction for resilience. And in this case, the idea of this goal, of this priority, came basically in the notion and the factual evidence that existed that investing in disaster reduction and risk-informed investment and finance is critical for resilience and sustainable development. We constantly say that we cannot speak about sustainable development if this development is not resilient. In the reflection of what's behind this adoption is basically because it was clear at that moment, as it is now, that the economic losses due to disasters had increased the last 40 years due to a number of factors such as population growth, concentration of economic and infrastructural assets in vulnerable areas, and also this combined with the intensity and frequency of hazards due to climate change, this make this combination, this cocktail, so damaging for the aspirations of sustainable development of countries. The experience of Hurricane Ian last week and the Storm Fiona in North America last month, and the Hurricane Eta and Iota in Central America in 2020, as well as the Hurricane Maria, and remember the Caribbean in 2017, are examples that we are systematically underinvesting in prevention and resilience. And both, not only in the developing world, but also in the developed world. So in 2020, the total insured losses from natural and human-induced hazards alone amounted to an estimated 200 billion, up 25% that the amount that existed in 2019. These are figures coming from Swiss Re. So in Canada, for example, a recent report by the GHT Group, which is, is an international engineering firm, warns that flooding alone is expected to cost the Canadian economy over 40 billion leading to 2050. So the question here is how much would be required to make the infrastructure resilient? So the global need for urban infrastructure investment, it is estimated at 5 trillion per year, more or less globally. And as per estimates of the World Bank, an additional premium between 9 to 27% would make this infrastructure low carbon and climate resilient. So given the serious socioeconomic disruptions at the local, national, and regional and global levels and across sectors, we know that financing climate resilient infrastructure cannot only depend on governments and must require the engagement of the private sector. And governments have a key role to play in this, generating these right incentives to mobilize the private sector and leverage these capital markets to encourage risk-reducing behaviors. And let me finish with this, is what is needed. Risk prevention projects need to draw on all potential beneficiaries for funding. Innovative financing models such as blended finance, investments that explicitly address resilient impacts have started to emerge as tools. And we have another opportunity also when we see, for example, how we can introduce prevention and resilience as a key criteria in environmental and social and governance standards, as well in the existing financial products such as bonds. We have recently seen how these climate resilient bonds, green bonds, social and sustainability linked bonds are emerging and becoming a very useful instrument for developing countries. But also there is a need to incorporate or integrate within these new instruments their resilience criteria. It would be beneficial also to foster national DRR financing strategies that explicitly address this within these instruments, the identification of an optimal mix of financing from domestic and international and public and private sources. We have a recent good example in Uruguay, for example, that 2 weeks ago adopted a reference framework for potential issuance of bonds that are indexed to climate change indicators. And this is aligned to the sustainability-linked bond principles of the International Capital Market Association, the ICMA. So these type of instruments at the national level demonstrate that it is possible to invest in disaster resilience, and that the disaster reduction or resilience strategy would need to set out the responsibilities, incentives, and the liabilities of national governments, the financial bodies, and also the private sector in terms of investments and the modalities. So this is what we wanted to share with you briefly, and then open to the questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raul. And this last slide here is very good for us, especially with the resolution. As everyone knows, the resolution is one of the main outcomes of the Urban Economy Forum. So there's some good examples that we can also include. I would now like to call Robert Bartlett to the stage.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to take 5 minutes here. So when we started this morning, you heard me touch on a couple of concepts, and I wanted to go further in those. We didn't really have time to explore them as much. And so as I look at all of the different concepts we've covered over the day, there's one that really stood out. So I've changed my speaking notes a little bit. And for me, as a municipal government employee in the government sector, I think the challenge that I face most is how do I get the topic of climate resilience, infrastructure resilience, and what I say by that, I mean investment in the right places and buy-in. How do I get that topic brought into a senior level? And you might say it's quite easy. You know, we've been in this climate game. I've been in the climate game 25 years. My first degree, my second degree was in climate adaptation, and 25 years later, I'm probably going to say the same thing as I did, at that time. And still, I think the challenge is there. The buy-in doesn't come naturally. And I think everything we've talked about today and everything we're going to end up with tomorrow in terms of the resolutions is where we need to springboard. So what do I face in West Vancouver? West Vancouver, undoubtedly one of the richest municipalities by land use in Canada, which sounds great, but comes with challenges. A lot of rich people have a lot of opinions. And therefore, how do we change or manipulate their opinions to look at the challenges that we face? And how do we link that to something that's very core to what I believe what all of our values should be, is the integration and collaboration to the private sector, leveraging the good private sector people, and making sure we're looking at truth and reconciliation and learning from the First Nations. So it's a complex subject, and I need to be able to sell that subject across the board. So at a minimum, how are we going to look at climate resilience, and how do we articulate that problem? And I'll tell you the problem that I believe that we've come to is you need to take actions, but they need to be tangible. So let me tell you what I've done in terms of climate. I started slow. I built a climate strategy. I built a position that looked at climate management, climate adaptation and resilience. And then from there, I added a tax levy. I added a 1.5% tax levy to the base tax that I tax my residents to make sure I was walking the walk. And because of that, the momentum started. So where did we get to now? From the climate levy comes the climate strategy and a series of goals and actions that can tangibly link to some change. And that's what's made a difference. And now the leaders that I used to try and convince to come with me are already coming with me because they're seeing, in many ways, a political benefit. And we haven't spoken much about politics these last 2 days, but if we're going to get our Prime Minister, our heads of the province, our elected officials on board, which is how you get policy change, then you've got to take them with you. You know, in government, we have what I call the trifecta of opportunity. I've got 3 things I can do. I can advocate, which is what I just talked about. I can regulate, which is land use planning in terms of what we're talking about here, in terms of our assets, and how we use our land, how we look at climate adaptation, which I do and I'll tell you about, or I can invest. I can take the taxpayers' money and I can invest that, or the province or the feds. I can only do those things. Now, we need a balance of all of those things, and I think I'm finding that right balance. How do I get Roger's money to do some stuff? How do I force private sector and force that collaboration? And then how do we all advocate for the same thing? So what did I change? And I'm going to focus on the environment. We can talk about a lot of things, but we've only got 5 minutes. In addition to those pieces that I talked about, I changed the budget process so we do twice-yearly review. And what does that mean? It means we're constantly looking at our budget and saying, did we spend it? Can we invest it better? Is there a new technology? Are we agile enough to take a hold of that new technology as a government and take a risk on it? Well, to do that, you have to answer that question, what's my risk tolerance? So we're starting on that journey as a municipal government, and I think we've got a long way to go. And I looked at this forum to be the pressure point to make municipal, federal, provincial governments change. I also changed what my departments do. So for those of you who don't know, municipal government, 120 lines of business. You wouldn't be in any of these lines of business if you're a private company, because it just don't make money. They're a service. But with a service, you also need metrics. So that's going to be the final piece I talk about. There needs to be data. You can't make decisions without data. Where am I investing? What is my return on investment? If it's climate adaptation, if it's how I'm separating the sewers, if it's how I'm looking at grey water, if it's how I'm raising the foreshore to make sure sea level rise doesn't impact, I need data. And it's been successful. So I guess where I would end on this piece, last week I was fortunate enough to pick up the award for climate adaptation for the work we've done on development planning on foreshore rise in West Vancouver. Now, not only am I proud of that as an entity, the work that went into it, the recognition of what I would call a traditional municipality like mine to take that leap and be at the forefront and actually say it's going to cost X million dollars per person to do was scary, but now it's getting that recognition. So that's, for me, one of the most exciting things you can see. When you see that tangible result, then you're on your way. You know, we've done climate, we've looked at green bonds, we've looked at other things, green budgeting. I'm looking at adding a specific line item on green budgeting into my departmental spending. So my $150 million operating, always ask the question, how are we changing the environment with this? I think I must have run over my 5 minutes. There's a lot more I can say about this, obviously. I'm happy to come back for a few hours. But thank you for listening to that, and happy to take questions later.
Thank you so much, Robert. Let's just do a quick little check on our audience there to see if we do have Dawn or Yvonne present. Okay, so what we will do is we'll move to questions. I suppose if we can open up the chat box on the screen there, just so we can see. It scrolls to the very bottom. Okay, so none of those questions appear to be for us. So perhaps if anyone from the audience or anybody in the virtual world wants to ask any questions to Roger, Raul, or Robert, you're welcome to do so now. Joffrey has a question. I'll come to you.
You have the mic. Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. Go ahead. Okay, thanks very much. Very impressive presentation. You raised a key point, which I think we'd all agree is important, and that's the need for raising public and political support. All the issues we've discussed yesterday and today are vital, but it's how we get to the next stage of implementation. What you said was a very good start. You said you could spend hours. Could you spend a couple of minutes just saying how would you go to the next stage of building that public and political support? Thanks very much.
Thanks for the question. It's down to taking the time to make sure you've got that support coming with you, make sure you have that data, and those policies need to be relevant. So political cycles work in England, it was about 2 years, in Canada it's about the same, 2 to 3 years, where you get elected, you have a very short period of time to capitalize on what's good and what's right, and then you move into how do I get re-elected? So the policies that we create, they needed to be tangible so that it didn't get in the way of the election cycle. And I think that's the thing I struggled with the most. But as you get through that, and I think really, I tried to do it big. I tried to write a strategy first, not around the environment, it was around land use planning. And I said, well, okay, let's start big, let's write a strategy, and it's the right strategy to do. And it was the right strategy, but it didn't get the support because it was too big, it was too much. So to get that political support was how do you take those smaller, quick wins? I think I talked about the change to the budget. I talked about adding a project around piping infrastructure. I talked about we did agile piping from Japan. There's a lot of small projects that once they get that momentum, then they turn into, oh, well, this is a political win for me. As soon as it becomes a political win, then you're moving forward. The award I mentioned last week, how we hold it in such high regard because that was the exact tactic we took. We persevered. We went to the community 15 times. We held roundtables. We tried to convince people that were going to be affected by millions of dollars by raising their homes. This was a good idea. And I wouldn't have been successful if I couldn't have convinced those people. So grassroots communication, political acumen, and low-level projects building to a crescendo in terms of the strategy and the policy that you end up with.
Well, I think you've touched on the fundamental issue. In Europe, it's quite clear that all political stripes have aligned around green and climate. In America, we still think it's political. I mean, I'm attached to an insurance company. 15, 20 years ago, they told us that the severity and frequency of weather-related events is going up at an asymptotic rate. This is science. We had a federal election cycle where it was the first time where the three major parties agreed that climate was an issue. Alas, I think we may have lost one of the two parties now. So this is, and there is disinformation. There are people lying. So citizens are confused. They vote, they purchase, they make economic decisions. It's a very, 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 very serious issue. The problem is going to be solved, I think, one way, which is catastrophes are going to still keep on happening. Past couple of weeks, it's been a daily, you just open the TV, just check on your website, and you're seeing what's going on. And it's coming closer, and it's hitting more communities that aren't not used to it. So I think people are starting to understand that there's something afoot. And we do it because we have the science behind it, and we can show our investors, and firstly, I can show my portfolio managers. Portfolio managers will do nothing if they don't have a grounding of this is going to help their performance, right? So it's a very, very, very shocking issue, very fundamental, but I think it's on its way to being resolved. I think the second thing is it's also a generational war. We have to make now short-term investment decisions or purchasing or economic decisions, which may have an added cost in order to pay for the externalities, which will only be born for our children or our grandchildren, right? So that's why Mark Carney called it the tyranny of the horizon, right? It's a long-term event until it happens in your community. And you have to deal with it now, because the space of change is already underway. So, one way is to mitigate, that's clear, we know we have to keep on doing that, but the public doesn't quite understand. And also, it's not clear, how to do it. The other thing, finally, just to close off, is there's an absence of price mechanisms. I'm sorry, I'm an economist, but if you put a price on pollution or price on bad externalities, you start incenting substitution, discovery, abating the use of that product or that is costly. We keep on calling it a tax. We keep on and we refuse to pay now, so that in the next generation or the generation after that, they won't deal with it. So it's a complex problem, but I think it will keep on going, and we just have to keep on pressing forward, and we have to have people like Robert that advance the issues. And when communities face a catastrophe, and human nature is fantastic, we react extremely well to catastrophes. We don't solve very complex problems, long-dated problems very well, but then communities can come together, and they're willing to pay a little more tax so that they can create berms, or they can create infrastructure that will render their community more resilient. And I think the slide before showed a $1 of investment ahead of time for $15. That's how you get private sector in there. If I charge you $5 for 15 savings, that's 10 net. 5 sounds good. We could probably do it for 3, right? But you need to give a return to private capital. And it's not about concessionary investments. My clients are pensioners. They cannot afford to make concessions, but they will give you capital to create non-financial outcomes. And it's complex. It's a great question, and it's one we really need to get a knock on. We are responsible for our governments, so it's all up to us.
Thank you. Raul, did you have anything you'd like to add?
No, thank you. Not at this stage. Thank you. Not at this stage.
Thank you, Raul. I open it up again to the audience. Perhaps we can take a quick look at the chat again, just make sure we're not missing anything. Anybody else from our in-person audience here? Sure. So it looks like we have a question from Vaishali. I'll just read both of the last 2 points. There are forces spending 4 times more to convince people that climate change is a hoax. The big question is, how do we educate common people, consumers, so they demand the change? They should have their voices included in this
matter. It's an excellent question. I think it leads on from what Roger was just talking about it. How do we educate people? You can't. But what you can do is you use the disasters that we just faced. So in West Vancouver, we faced a heat dome last year. Then in Christmas time, my Christmas day was spent responding to unprecedented flooding and rain. And so it destroyed our seawall, which is one of our key assets. The education that you need came right then. Because then that was when I looked at my budget and I said, now is the time for me to ask for my environmental levy. Now is the time for me to get my senior manager of climate adaptation. Now is the time to start writing my strategy. Now, I'd started all these things behind the scenes, but I didn't have the catalyst to get me to the next level. I prepped the policy work on the climate levy and the position 2 years ago, and I was waiting because I couldn't get the advocacy in place to make sure this would work. I couldn't convince my community to move forward. But from that unfortunate event, I was able to say, okay, we have a lot more problems here, we need to look after it. And it's not just about the physical assets, it was about the social kind of inequity that I found in my district. It was about tackling multiple things where you have poverty with more affluence, where you have climate adaptation not really listened to. One of the challenges is, can we not just delay, and I'll directly quote, can we not just delay the actions for 10 years? I'll just deal with it in 10 years' time. And that's a difficult thing to look at. So the answer is no. You've got to keep pushing forward. But where the final pieces I'll talk about, the final challenge there is you need a level of bravery to stand up to the current status quo, or the status quo we're trying to get through. And that's difficult because I was worried about my job. And I think anybody in this business would be worried that you're trying to advocate for something that doesn't want to change. But someone has to take a stance, so it's up to us to take a stance. I completely agree, and put the worries to one side and know that if we take this right path, it will work, and it's working for me. I think, yeah, that's where that probably covers my part of that question.
And I think you keep on really benefiting from, keep making the most of a crisis. I think that's the sad step. But the crisis doesn't need to be near you. You don't have to be living through it. There's enough going around. And I think that, there is, we are inexorably advancing. There's so much opportunity. And the fact that you've got capital there aligned now with government spending, that government can put levers in that either protect the downside or change the risk framework of a project. Those are all opportunities, and I think as soon as most of those projects go forward, then we can make the most of it, and people start to understand. So I think it's the theory of small steps, but on many fronts. And the science is inevitable. So at some point, we'll have the inflection point, and this will be an acceleration. But until then, we have to fight every battle.
Again, Raul, I turn over to you. If you have any.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. Well, if we take the question to the perspective of what we do in our office, we are an office that is basically trying to convince governments that investing in disaster risk reduction is worth, that making or taking preventing measures or investing their own resources, national budgets in disaster reduction, save life, save the economy, save the possibilities of the sustainable development of the country. And if you go under that, you try then to convince not only governments and ministers and sectors, but also population, cities, communities. What we have found out that works is basically that you have to produce evidence. It's evidence-based information. You carry out this advocacy on people, sensitizing based on this evidence-based information that first disasters actually happen, that the hazards are around them, and that there is a possibility to act before disasters strike to change things. And this is possible, and you not have to be the messenger. You can ask for other peers to transmit their own experience. When we approach, for example, something in the private sector, convincing the private sector, not a usual partner for disaster reduction, it's how you convince the private sector that making disaster reduction is important for them. It's just making or producing evidence that disasters affect their bottom line. Telling them that when a disaster strikes, 7 out of 10 small and medium enterprises do not come back to business, or that is very unlikely, 60% of probability that you are going to lose your market position if a disaster strikes. It's the kind of example that the Port of Kobe has. So we have built a large network in the Americas and the Caribbean of private sector, what we call national networks of disaster reduction of the private sector. And there is one in Canada, and there is one in the United States, and there are 20 more countries that have created this network because they have bought in of the idea that disasters affect them directly, and they can take action. Basically, if they have information on where to locate physically locate a factory, where to physically locate a small enterprise, how do they big businesses connect and work through the value chain to make these small companies resilient. There we are teaching, there we are producing education for change. We need to work more because the examples I provided are basically, we are more used to natural hazards. And the reality is telling us that the risks are more complex, the hazards are more complex, are interconnected, are cascade effects, and the COVID-19 is a clear example of that. And we are not up to the task yet to face that type of risks. We need more information, more cooperation among different sectors, not only within the government, but also among sectors on the private sector and in the different levels of governments, local governments, communities, and cities.
Thank you, Raul. I think there was a follow-up question from Vaishali as well. In the chat there, it said, and I'll quickly read the follow-up question. Convince the private sector, I think it's a question of clarity, convince the private sector or gain their confidence so they will invest and take the risk. Do you have anything to add to that, Raul, based off of?
I think it is not gain their confidence. I think it's both in a way. But the thing is, if you realize that when a disaster strikes and the disasters have a probability of happening to you with a certain certainty, particularly the climate origin hazards, it is very likely that you are going to take action because it's going to affect you directly. Your business is going to affect your possibility of survival as an enterprise. And but sometimes we lose that information. We do not take that context into account. I mean, I don't know if it's natural or part of a human being to try to forget the negative events that have happened in the past. We do not have to go too much back in history to see that our last generation or the last the last 30 years, a disaster impacted in a particular area and destroyed a large part of the community or a large part of the whatever small businesses were there. But we tend to forget that. And I think that realizing that this information exists, keeping this information, this what we call loss and damage databases updated to make local decisions or to orient local decisions from the local governments, for example, to create this land use planning, for example. It's a way of supporting that decision making, providing information to make what we call risk-informed decisions. And it's a matter of convincing, yes, based on evidence, but also is self-preservation.
Thank you, Raul. I think we still have time for one or two more questions. I again turn to the audience, or perhaps if any of our panelists have a question or a follow-up question, you're welcome to share it. Yeah. Any final questions? So I guess my final question, or one of my questions would be, we're looking at the Urban Economy Forum resolution, one of the major outcomes of our forum each year. This is the fourth time we've prepared this, and it's meant to provide kind of some recommendations for urban stakeholders, and in particular, urban city leaders. Perhaps we can, from each of our three panelists, if you have one kind of bullet that you would say is important, kind of the top, number one thing that city leaders should be doing, should implement today. Do you have any suggestions?
Okay. I'm not sure I can say the top one. I think I've got 10 things that I've learned today that I think we need to work on straight away. So I'll take, if you're going to push me for just one, I would say this. We have a catalyst in front of us with a forum like this. We have a time pressure to make changes. So the resolutions will come from the panel this morning, from this panel. We can define what the actual actions are, but But I would say we need to look into the future and say, what are our crunch points that we can utilize? I was talking to the gentleman earlier that we have the Prime Minister of Canada on a forum for the next 11 months. So we have a time crunch right there. Now, if we're successful in getting the Olympics in 2030 in BC, we have another time crunch right there that we can use and capitalize on. So we've talked about all the solutions. We've talked about land use planning versus density and upzoning, capital investment, and I can convince Roger to invest in different things by community resilience. But why? Why do we want to do it today? Why do you want to do it tomorrow? Can't we just leave it for 10 years? It's a fundamental question. So I'd say, let's take one thing away. What are our key crunch points in our critical path for the next 30 years? Map them out and say, okay, I need to get to the Olympics. You heard a chap from Glasgow talk earlier, and he said, when he knew the world was coming to town for COP26, what did they do? They doubled down their efforts on the environmental, sustainable, and governance goals. They doubled down on them so that when the world went to Glasgow, there was a lot of things happening that people could get on board with. So let's say this, when the world comes back to Canada for whatever reason, let's double our efforts so that when the world comes, there's a whole bunch of things happening. So that's probably my top one, but I've got 50 more that I could use.
If I put on my corporate hat, I'm not a city expert, but I would say that you have a very good scope of the risks that you face, that communities face, and if it's very clear to you already, what are you doing about it? What are you doing to build resilience? And what kind of project is that? And so I think that would be, my recommendation is get everyone around a resilience framework. The sad story is in Canada, anyways, the data is quite clear that the 80% of the most exposed communities and individuals to risks are not aware that they're, like for instance, for floodplains. The 80% that are most exposed do not know that they're in a floodplain. So that's the kind of work we have ahead of us.
Raul, I turn it to you for one final, most important point to include on the UEF resolution.
Thank you. I think that the general call is that there is a need of a stronger integration of disaster risk reduction into the financial sector investment decisions. I think that one of our colleagues in the panel mentioning the inclusion of this comprehensive risk disclosure, like also this need of regulation and reporting standards, right? In the case of how we are to try to measure how we integrate this resilience in the process. Promoting a think resilient approach, meaning integrating resilience in the financial decision making should become mandatory in all public procurement processes as well as private sector investment. There are now instruments that allow, in this case, to make what we call a stress testing. One of the things that is becoming more and more present is the net zero emissions, right? We should probably start thinking also in net zero, net resilience. I mean, whatever we build shouldn't add to the risks in the future. So I think that this is basically what is needed. And one final thing is, in all countries, the capital formation in a country, 70% of that capital formation in a country, according to the World Bank, comes from the private sector. The other 30% is public. So it is impossible to start discussing about resilient sustainable development if these private-public partnerships do not start. So these are my final thoughts for the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Raul. I do believe we have still a little bit more time. I'm looking at my colleague's watch there, and I think Dawn has joined us. Dawn, if you'd like to, I think it's 2:10, looking at your watch, perhaps maybe, Dawn, if you had kind of any concluding remarks, or perhaps if you had something prepared, we would love to hear them.
Well, thanks, folks, and I have to apologize. This is the danger of doing two conferences at once in three different time zones, and I'm just mortified. I'm in British Columbia, which puts me an hour further behind than I usually am. So I thought I was 15 minutes early, but regrettably, I am 45 minutes late. So first of all, I think the main thing is to thank our friends and the organizers at UEF for adjusting. I am mortified and very apologetic for the error, which is mine, time zone issue in my calendar. So really, I think at this point it falls for me on behalf of my colleagues at Cooperators who take a strong interest, as you will have heard about from Roger, in supporting opportunities to build resilience in partnership, grand societal partnership across orders of government, across communities, across regions, and across both private and public sector players to enhance resilience in our communities. And I regret that I wasn't able to hear from all of our presenters, but having read ahead about some of the work that Robert and his team are doing in West Vancouver to look ahead to sea level rise and coastal challenges, which are top of mind after what's happened on the East Coast in the last couple of weeks, understanding the length and breadth of the tree planting initiatives in Freetown, in response to erosion and flooding and mudslide issues. And just hearing from Raul about some of the extraordinary work UNDRR is championing, which Cooperators is privileged to be a part of. And of course, Roger, who manages investments on behalf of our cooperative mutual insurance company. There are many projects out there that need funding, many opportunities to get creative about how to fund them, and many opportunities to build resilience. So notwithstanding that I couldn't join you for all of it, I do want to thank all of our panelists for their contributions to the discussion and the work that each of them is doing in their organizations and in their spheres of influence to improve our resilience to disaster risk, which is only worsening for us, sadly, in light of our inability to act fast enough to stem climate change. But I'll say that I think a lot of what we're learning and facing around climate adaptation will be transferable to support resilience across other perils besides climate, and generally to find models to build infrastructure that address equity issues, that support nature-based solutions, and put a price on what it is that ecosystem services do for us, because all of that will be necessary to enhance our resilience and adapt to climate change. So all of this is deeply relevant to not just climate perils, but the challenges facing humanity. And so I'm grateful to each of the panelists for their efforts. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to meet them all, but I'm grateful to each of them for their contributions.
Thank you so much, Don. And Don, I do believe you joined us at Urban Economy Forum 2 and 3, and now you're here at 4. So it's excellent to have you again here. And maybe as a sign-off note, I asked all the other panelists, but you, as being a former mayor of Edmonton, if there's one kind of major action that cities need to implement today, city leaders, to realize more sustainable development, sustainable finance. One bullet, perhaps you could share your thoughts on that.
I thank you for the question, and I think understanding risk. This is as we've done work to understand what will be necessary to build capacity to do resilience investing, understanding the underlying risk seems to be one of the largest gaps. And there are many frameworks for how to do that, but the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures gives a good template for all organizations, including governments, to assess their chronic and acute climate risks and begin to understand where their exposure is and start a conversation with their public. It can be quite scary to talk with your public about known flood risks, around wildland-urban interface issues relative to fire, about coastal erosion. But we need to understand those risks and start to have public conversations about them so that we can create momentum around mitigating those risks and build investment cases and find creative cash flows and co-benefits, whether it's splitting the arrow on heat pumps to deal with heat that also help us decarbonize, or whether it's using nature to support flood management and cooling and beautify streets and provide shade. There are multiple business cases, multiple beneficiaries, and especially in the case of resilience infrastructure, we talk a lot about 6-to-1 paybacks or 11-to-1 paybacks. We don't have to find all 6 of those dollars. We just have to find probably 2 of them to pay the interest and maybe pay some risk transfer and performance fees to deliver a solution that's going to materially de-risk. And then you're still, $4 or $9 ahead. But you got to start with risk awareness and understand where the vulnerabilities are, because it's not well enough understood by individual homeowners and property owners, and partly that's because it's not well enough understood by municipalities. So adopting a rigorous and consistent risk assessment framework through something like TCFD, and ultimately I think that should be mandated actually, so that we can roll up those risk assessments at the regional scale, at the watershed scale, and so provinces and national governments can price out those exposures and start to build a plan to materially de-risk our communities, because otherwise, and our CEO cooperators, Rob Wessling, puts this really well. There is no transition to a net zero future without adding resiliency, because the disasters will knock us back off course, knock us into overshoot, not just through the supply chain disruptions and the economic disruptions and the insurable losses and the uninsurable losses, but through the GHG footprint of the mop-up and the rebuild. So we've got to add in resiliency, and it's not an either or from transition. We actually have to achieve resiliency in an integrated way with our transition to a low carbon future. But understanding those risks and how they might knock us off course is absolutely elemental to that.
Thank you so much, John. And I think with that, we are at time. So I will close the panel there. Thank you so much to all our panelists for joining us. I look forward to the next panel session.